Who can take a flower, roll it up and make it fine, sprinkle it with knowledge and a little bit of time, cover it with headlines and a sweet euphoria too. Cannabis man, cannabis man, cannabis man, spreading news and joy across the land, diving deep into the growing green. Cannabis man, we're all king.
Ooh, yeah. Hello and welcome into another episode of the Cannabis Man podcast. Thank you so much for clicking on the show and taking this opportunity to listen. I'm your host, Don Kleppin. And if it's your first time here, I appreciate you checking it out. It's a show where we're taking a journalistic look at all things cannabis. I'm a broadcaster in Chicago. I do news on the radio. You can hear me on WGN 720 AM. You can also hear me on some other stations from time to time. And a few years back, I decided that I wanted to start bringing conversations which featured some information about what cannabis might be able to offer people out there in terms of quality of life improvements. As a member of the regular old legacy media, even though cannabis has been spreading to states around the United States as well as the rest of the world now, other countries have started legalizing, there seems to be a lot more familiarity with, as I like to say, Cheech and Chong jokes and last century's propaganda than there is with the real, tangible, potential medical benefits and quality of life improvements that cannabis can offer people. And so that was why I decided to create this show, to bring you conversations with informed experts and try and do my small part to kill the stigma that still lingers around this plant that humans have been using for thousands of years. And just so you know, though I am pro-cannabis, it's really helped me out a lot with many things. I do not believe that it's right for everybody. The people who have tried it and had a bad experience, or maybe tried it multiple times and it doesn't work for you, when people say that it's not for them, I believe them. That's as real as the benefits are to me and to those of us in this space. So I'm not sitting here preaching that cannabis is right for everybody, but I do think there are many, many people out there who could use the benefits from it, who maybe never gave it a shot because of its prohibited status and all that propaganda from Reefer Madness and all that. If you would be so kind as to leave a rating or a review for this show, however you're listening, whether it's on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube, there's an opportunity to click a subscribe button so you always get notified about new episodes, and an opportunity to leave a rating or review for the show or comment on an episode. Any and all of that is most welcome from me. I appreciate any engagement that the show gets. I also tend to ask some questions or ask for feedback throughout these episodes. If you hear that and you want to offer something, or you have a guest suggestion or a question you'd like to see explored, there's a link down in the description notes to text Cannabis Man. Click that and you will get a message to me, and then I will take that forward. On these episodes, I like to share news stories, my perspective, as well as some product reviews and other information I think is worth your attention alongside those expert interviews. And my guest interview today is an expert in the field of many years, a former journalist, a lot like myself, but he started a PR firm specifically to help businesses sort of rebrand or get their marketing aligned in the right way, as well as helping people get the messaging out, a lot like I'm doing here, about cannabis, what it can offer, what's true and what's not true out there. He is the founder and CEO of Grasslands PR, Ricardo, Baca, and I'll be chatting with him a little bit later. We talk about our shared experience coming from journalism, the legacy propaganda that I just alluded to at the beginning, and sort of the battle to get the truth out. We also talk about media coverage of cannabis, including people in the space who sometimes reject information that has been shown to be true by research. I'm talking like cannabis hypermesis syndrome and the psychosis that has popped up among some users. We also discuss the thorny topic of addiction among cannabis users. You know how I feel about it, the nuance versus physical and mental addiction. We talk about the rescheduling. There's some big news on that front that came out this week, which I'll get to as well. And because we're both in the communications space, we talk about the terms cannabis and marijuana, and Ricardo kind of gives his opinion on which we think is better. So, lots to get to on this episode and plenty more, so let's kick it open. It's the Cannabis Man Podcast.
This is Tommy Chong, and you're listening to the Cannabis broadcast.
Yeah, all right. And now before I get into the news joint wrap and give you some news stories, I want to tell you a little bit of an update on my dry January. I don't know if you're in this with me at all or if you're just kind of sitting on the sidelines thinking how crazy I am to do this, but I mentioned on last week's episode that my modified dry January is as follows. I abstained from cannabis, alcohol, caffeine, and added sugars. And as I got into last week, caffeine is always the hardest part, but after the first 2-3 days, I haven't really had any issues with this. I do still, through the days, reflexively crave cannabis. Of course I do. I've leaned on it for going on, almost 20 years now. And so, of course, there are plenty of days when I find myself thinking how great it would be to light up a joint, crack open a beverage, pop an edible, any one of those things that sort of, it helps me with not just getting to sleep at night, which is what led me to leaning on this plant in the first place. But I've leaned on it for a lot of other things over the years. I turned to it for stress relief, for helping focus. I love taking it sometimes before or after exercising. After dinner, big fan of that. Or maybe popping a nice hefty edible on a weekend and just kind of getting locked into the couch to watch something with my wife. Lots of great situations where I feel like cannabis kind of elevates the vibe. And I will admit, because it is that crutch that I lean on so often, it does come up in my mind through this month of January. But I'm recording this now on January 17th, which means 2 weeks from tomorrow, the month is over. And I'm really looking forward to that Saturday, February 1st. Gretchen and I have already laid out a handful of plans for me to look forward to on how to celebrate the return to my normal existence and sort of put this dry January in the rear view. But I do want to give you a bit of a snapshot of kind of what these past 17 days have entailed. And the biggest thing I will say that I notice, as well as a topic that comes up a lot related to cannabis and its relationship with sleep, REM sleep specifically, is that every night my dreams are vivid and it feels like I have a lot of them. While I'm using cannabis, oftentimes I don't remember my dreams. If I have them, it feels like I just kind of, close the eyes, you drop down and then you pop up again in the morning, your eyes open and there you go, which is excellent. And I know that that's why many people, one of the many reasons people will turn to it, not just helping with getting to sleep at night, but also the freedom from some dreams, which oftentimes are not pleasant. Thankfully, mine haven't been of that variety. I wouldn't really call them pleasant or unpleasant. They've kind of been middle of the road, but they're still vivid, very memorable the day after. I find myself, reflecting on little bits of them throughout the day. I had one the other night where I was, on some kind of indoor football field, but it was a lot shorter than normal, and everyone else was wearing pads and equipment, and I was not. And it was like a kickoff return, and I was running with this team, and I thought I was on the other team, and it turned out I was on the opposing side, and I was just, doing things I shouldn't have been doing. It was really goofy. Just a totally goofy dream, and it melted into something else from there. But that has been pretty much every nightly experience for me, which is a big change from when I'm using cannabis. So if you are going for a tolerance break, if you are experimenting with a dry January, or even just starting for a few days, which is what I recommend, if you're interested in a tolerance break, give it a shot for 2-3 days. Just kind of see how that goes for yourself. But something to expect is the resurgence of vivid dreams. And so I just say that so that you can plan accordingly. But, in addition to the no cannabis, as I mentioned, it's no caffeine, no added sugars, and Gretchen and I have jumped back onto an eating plan called Fast Burn, which sort of combines intermittent fasting and eating more nutritiously. And I've been, when I do these dry months, I exercise most days anyway, but during January, I'm exercising every day, sometimes twice a day, which helps me get to sleep. But all of that stuff combined, I'm sitting here now down 10 pounds in the last 17 days. So that is another thing that the way that I do dry January, weight loss is a benefit that I have come to rely on. And it's a nice reset after the holidays. I think all of us gain a few, holiday pounds. You go see family, you indulge a little bit in some great food, some good drink, some good company and all of that. And it lasts a couple of weeks. And then, before you know it, you enter into January of the next year and you're a few pounds heavier. Well, maybe all of these abstinences that I'm doing, maybe they sound extreme, but it's a great way to shed some of those holiday pounds and just kind of kick off the year on a very productive note. So that is what I have been up to. If you have any questions about dry January or tolerance breaks in general, hit the Text Cannabis Man link down below. Or you can reach out to the show on social media at C-Man Podcast on X and Instagram, and the Cannabis Man Podcast Facebook page and YouTube channel. Now, let's jump into the News Joint wrap. This is a wrap-up of news stories and events brought to you by IllinoisNewsJoint.com. I want to start with the Department of Public Health in the state confirming 4 new conditions that qualify for medical cannabis treatment. This is an article by Jason Brown put out last week, and it relates to the Compassionate Use of Medical Cannabis program. The 4 conditions, as Jason notes, that are effective immediately include endometriosis, ovarian cysts, uterine fibroids, and female orgasmic disorder. Jason provides a lot more information about these and some context, but if you or someone you know suffers from any of those in the state of Illinois, they now qualify for medical cannabis. And so it's something that more people should know about. I have linked this article below for you to check out if you're interested. Another article that Jason put out last week is that the Illinois yearly medical cannabis sales have dropped for the 3rd straight year. This comes after IDPH released its December medical cannabis sales totals and final for the year. For 2024, retail sales by licensed medical cannabis dispensaries finished at $285,059,601.92. Jason notes 2024 totals continue a 3-year downward trend for yearly totals, dropping below $300 million for the first time since 2019. Last year's totals dropped nearly $40 million from 2023, which were down $29 million from 2022. So the trend there, pretty obvious. And as I've talked about, medical patients, there are fewer of them compared with the recreational market. I know a lot of dispensaries, some of them don't even deal with the medical side of things. They only go full recreational. They may give you a discount if you're a med patient with a card, but that's about it. So I think, and then you have all the tourists coming in from other states that are obviously recreational customers there too. So I think there are a lot of factors at play here, but I gotta be honest, it is still a disturbing trend. And I say disturbing because I think that the medical card that I've gotten for cannabis, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. And I'm going to have to renew it in, I think, September of this year. But the savings on taxes, as well as the savings on time by being able to jump to the front of the line when you go to dispensaries that do serve medical patients, there's no question. I mean, those savings alone financially paid for the card 10 times over, allowing me also to buy more cannabis products at once. But being able to run in and out of the dispensary when sometimes there's a line out the block and you get to jump right to the front of that line and you get served and then you're out in 5 minutes, that never ceases to be satisfying. I mean, it's a real rock star moment every single time. So you got 4 new conditions that qualify you for a medical card. If you've thought about it, lots of great companies can help you. A lot of the dispensaries now are offering assistance getting your med card. I'm telling you, from my perspective, it's worth it. Something to consider and explore. Jason provides more details about this as well at the article, which is linked below. And I talked last week about the issue of hemp products and how it's kind of pitted the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, against the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson. And they sort of represent two sides of this issue, with the governor describing a potential ban or pushing for a ban of hemp products outright, and Mayor Johnson pushing for regulation of them. And so now Jason noted a week ago today in this article that 2 votes during the lame duck session of the Illinois House were not voted on. However, 2 new hemp regulation bills were introduced last Friday. One by Rep. Sonia M. Harper and LaShawn Ford, who I've had on this show, and he has some great perspective about cannabis and hemp as well. If you haven't listened to that episode, you should check it out, but he's doing very, very good work. And so these bills are 0064 and 0001, respectively. And as Jason notes, 0064 provides provisions regarding regulations, licensing, and testing hemp, but would regulate regulate hemp without altering the legal definition of hemp set forth in the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, which is that farm bill, which I bring up a lot on the show, and which is still being operated under to this day. 7 years later. A lot more context and perspective in the rest of that article, which is also linked below. And there are a few reviews and dispensary highlights, which Jason always does well on IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Recent reviews include the Creams Gummies by OG's, which I reviewed on the show as well. Love those. I love the products that OG's has put out. Also, Bitter Orange Vape Cart by FloraCal and Baccio Belts by Northern Heights. All of that and continuing more coverage of cannabis and events and news in and around Illinois. All of that for you at IllinoisNewsJoint.com. Listener, welcome back. My guest today is doing some very important work in the space of legal cannabis, and it's a mission that resonates deeply with myself, as it's a big part of kind of what led me to starting the show, which you've heard me talk about ad nauseum at this point, so I won't reiterate it. But the point is the messaging around cannabis, as we witness this new green frontier changing all the time, the legal cannabis space, not just here in the U.S., where states are legalizing at a very quick pace. We already have something like 28 recreational states, and there are certainly more than that medically. So we're past the halfway point for American states who have legalized, and more are looking at that. And then other countries around the world. Canada's been legal for quite some time. Germany, just this year earlier, activated some provinces that are now legal, as well as Uruguay, medical in the Ukraine. Other countries are looking at it as well. So it's a big time for legal cannabis. And so therefore the messaging around it, the words that we use, the way that we cover the topic, as I've said on the show all the time, less stereotypes from the Reefer Madness days. Let's go fewer Cheech and Chong jokes and more on the real quality of life improvements and the benefits that can be offered to people by cannabis and how best they can incorporate it into their lives. And there is a PR firm, a marketing firm, who is doing that exact same work as well. They have taken it upon themselves to move this important mission forward and to help people, companies who are, creating brands and, brand stories for themselves, as well as, products and just this cannabis space. They are doing their part to move it forward, and they have this exact mission in mind. And I'm talking about Grasslands PR, and I'm speaking today with the founder and CEO of Grasslands, Ricardo Baca, to talk exactly about this. Welcome, Ricardo. Thanks for jumping on today.
What is up, Don? Great to be here with you, man.
Thank you so much for taking the time. And so just in that intro, I'm talking about the mission that we have talking about cannabis and that notion of how familiar people are with last century's propaganda, with the Reefer Madness side of things versus the work that you and I are trying to do, which is sort of a rebrand. That's ultimately what we're talking about here, cleaning up the reputation of cannabis. So what I like to do with these interviews, Ricardo, is just tell us a little about yourself and how you came to be in this space.
Yeah, of course, Don. Happy to share a little bit of my story, but per what you just said, I actually kicked off my first TED Talk with that exact construct, recognizing that this 80-year prohibition, this 80-year war on drugs has been incredibly successful, and it has brainwashed all of us to some deeper than others. And what I encouraged folks to do in that first TED Talk was really press Control-Alt-Delete on your brain. And for some of the younger listeners, that might be a dated reference, but really we do need to reset all of our brains as it relates to this. Because of course, you pick up facts along the way of your life from your childhood through your adulthood. And suddenly this becomes a fact because you heard it from a teacher or a parent. And the truth is, lots of those teachers and parents, either knowingly or unknowingly, were helping the federal government spread a lot of misinformation and a lot of dangerous propaganda that has ruined untold number of lives. So it is really imperative that we rebrand cannabis And this is not, crisis management, reputation management. This is really like doing what's right and modernizing this conversation, because the way we've talked about it in the past is a joke. And it's a really bad one that has harmed many, many people and caused recidivism and destroyed families and communities. So it's something I'm passionate about, and I appreciate the work you've put into this effort as well, Don. But my story is pretty simple. I was a journalist for 24 years. That was entirely at daily newspapers. I studied journalism at school, thought that was what I wanted to do, and I was right. Very proud of the journalism career that I had. Some of it was fun, reviewing music, reviewing bars. Others was a little bit more impactful, reporting on news and, being the first mainstream cannabis editor in the world, and props to the Denver Post for really having the foresight to see that. When Colorado was stepping out in 2013 to say, hey, we're the first in the world to ever do this. We're writing regs, launching a system of adult use sales, January 1st, 2014. I really do give the editors of the Denver Post props for having that vision and recognizing that not only was there opportunity, but also a responsibility. And that responsibility was, mainstream media for decades has parroted a lot of the misinformation of the federal government and so many others. Mainstream media was their primary megaphone to share all of this garbage information, all of these untruths to brainwash the public. And as I already said, it was very successful. And we really took our job seriously at the Denver Post and the Cannabis, which was the standalone news vertical that I stood up with my team. We took our jobs responsibly to really say that we need to be better. We need to look at this from a modern perspective, and we need to ditch old stereotypes that the mainstream media has just been repeating mindlessly, even though they weren't backed up by any real data or anything, because frankly, we didn't have anything until this last decade. I mean, public health information as it relates to cannabis consumption isn't really a thing still. We're in the nascency of that, 10, 11 years into a regulated market. Now is when we can actually find out, okay, what are those benefits to a population? What are those potential risks as well? Because cannabis legalization doesn't come without its risks, and we need to be realistic about looking at the good and the bad. And so I'm really proud of the work that we did in that journalism. And in 2016, as more and more states were legalizing, that was a big election, obviously. That was, I think we had 9 state ballot initiatives on Election Day 2016, reported on them all. And then a couple months later, I left the Denver Post. I left journalism to start a PR agency that I'd been dreaming about for a while, and that is Grasslands. We're coming up on our 8th anniversary, and we're a small PR firm. We're based in Denver, but we have colleagues in California, New York, and other states, and a small team of about 24 working hard on behalf of our clients to really steer their narratives in the right direction, but also to help them be better corporate citizens and help them join forces with us and so many others in working to end this war on drugs as well as cannabis prohibition federally. We need to make some more progress on this. And to your point in the opening remarks, great to see state progress, even with this year's election day. But at the same time need a lot more, and we really need it federally for obvious reasons that most people listening to this are familiar with.
Yeah, right on, Ricardo. And yeah, great story, very relatable to me. I'm coming from a legacy radio place, and I've mentioned that on the show a lot. I still do news on WGN here in Chicago, and it's been an interesting journey for me the last couple of years, kind of navigating this, where I'm going into the newsroom. I'm still meant to present kind of a neutral, unbiased front, which I do on other topics besides cannabis. And that's basically the arrangement that I have kind of with my news director, with the editor, with the owners of the station. Most of the time, I can report on cannabis stories, but I'll just, report what the newsroom has sort of put out there, unless I disagree with it, in which case I just stay away from it entirely. But to your point, Ricardo, the journalism side of it and the rebrand that's needed, there was so much since the prohibition started last century into this one. These mainstream megaphones, these legacy media companies, they really just took the press releases, the information given from the government, and just put it out there into the collective consciousness without necessarily pushing back on whether or not this was valid information, holding it up to sort of journalistic scrutiny, wondering whether or not this was true that they're putting out there. And some of that was to your point, the fact that we didn't have those numbers. We didn't have the studies that we did for alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, these kinds of things that are normalized and part of our society. We have a lot more data, hard data that we can report on, and that helps move the narrative along. Whereas cannabis, even though my friend Paul Armentano of Normal loves to say that we know all we need to know about cannabis, and I take his point that it's so many people have been using it for so long that we know it's not deadly, unlike what alcohol has the potential to do if used in great quantities and all that. So I take his point that way, but to your point, I think when you're talking about moving a narrative forward and when there's an opportunity for the mainstream media to talk about it, it's those hard results of studies. It's those real findings that are done in laboratories with government funding. We haven't had nearly enough of those done on cannabis, except for the last decade. Now we're finally starting to get those things. And I do think that that's really helpful in order to kind of do the work that we're talking about, that you do at Grasslands and that I'm doing here, which is to say, getting the right information, the real truth of what cannabis can offer to people, putting that out in the consciousness, which is difficult when you're kind of going up against the lies and the connotations that were baked in, that we absorbed from 30, 40, 50 years ago,
Hands down, agree with everything you said. And I think an often forgot component of that is, yes, it's our job to share the truth, but it's also our job to share the truth even when it's inconvenient for our narrative. I have noticed that as the mainstream media is really digging into some of these early known risks of cannabis use based on this first 10, 11 years of a regulated market and rising concerns around psychosis or cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. There is a knee-jerk reaction from much of the industry to say, oh, that's not real. And the truth is, it's like, I want to leave that with the medical professionals. I want them to tell me that it's real. And I also want to hold that up to a journalism level scrutiny because, some of these psychosis studies are a very, very small sample size. Let's talk about margins of error. Let's talk about credible polling and surveying and double-blind, placebo-controlled, gold standard studies and clinical research. So it is the good and the bad, but getting all of that information out there will be such a way to honor this very special plant that so much of our lives are modeled around.
Totally. Yeah. Great points there. And the one that I want to move forward on, which is that you touched on something that I totally get, which is to say a lot of the community, meaning the cannabis community, they inherently want to reject some of the more negative headlines that do come out. And you brought up some good ones: the hyperemesis syndrome, the high psycho. I'm not sure the right way of phrasing this, but the incidents of psychoactivity that have been reported in emergency rooms around the country when, let's say, younger users, and by younger I still mean maybe young adults, not even underage here, but people who haven't experimented with cannabis very much, and then they try something that's like 30, 40, 50% THC. It makes them incredibly anxious and they end up in an emergency room. There's a lot of the community that just wants to sort of write those off as like stupid people or uninformed, when the fact is it's real. Those things are real, just like maybe those of us who get help from cannabis, that's real to us. And so that's part of the responsibility that you're talking about, Ricardo, is kind of navigating that line of like, all right, well, what is true? And pursuing it the same way we do with other topics. One of the ones that has kind of made me laugh ever since I've been in this space, and I've been a user for getting close to 20 years here, just myself in my life, but like, even before it went legalized, I would laugh because so many of my friends will die on the hill that cannabis is non-addictive, right? And I've had this debate on the podcast a lot, and I don't mean to like drag you into a hornet's nest here. So by all means, if you don't want to, talk about it, that's fine. But I always laugh because I'm like, well, in the same breath, these people will swear to me that it's non-addictive. And when I suggest maybe it's time for a tolerance break, they'll break into cold sweats. And they will literally be like, oh, sure, I can stop. I just never want to. And it's kind of like, okay, I understand that it's not as physically addictive as something like nicotine or as something like alcohol or opioids, but that's a nuance. It can still be mentally addictive. We can become addicted as human beings to behaviors, non-substances at all. People get addicted to exercises or time outside or meditation or what have you. It's not reliant on a substance, but the behavior can still become addictive, and cannabis certainly falls under that category as well. So that's just something that's always made me laugh. It's kind of like when we're talking about this, we need to be able to have that nuance part of the discussion so we can say that, like, there is a risk of some addiction, even if it's not the same physical risk that you'll be dependent on it like you would some other substances.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, what you're speaking is the truth, Don. I mean, this is... it would be factually incorrect to say that cannabis is not addictive. And I also get so many of these advocates and activists' perspective, because we were lied to for 80 plus years about this plant, and they're just trying to right the wrongs. Yep. And they're trying to push back where they feel it's necessary. But, going back to my journalism training, you believe the experts, because nobody is an expert in everything. And so while some experts have a skewed perspective, there are certainly some medical professionals out there that are talking about how cannabis legalization represents a real evil and will destroy communities and then wipe out entire generations of kids, They're not credible experts. Don't believe them.
Right.
However, experts that are working within the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, and studying addiction. I mean, people who don't have skin in the game, who are not on the payroll of some advocacy organization on one side or the other. It's like, let's look to them to really help us understand this plant and how we interact with it as individuals and as a community.
Yeah, right on. Totally well said. And let's talk about this, the future that's kind of looking us in the face here. I would love to get your perspective on this potential rescheduling. What moving cannabis from Schedule 1 down to Schedule 3 under the Controlled Substances Act, what that might mean, not just for businesses, but for the narrative about cannabis, going forward from 2025 and beyond.
Yeah, this is, I very much align with the cohort of our colleagues who say that if rescheduling happens, this will be the most substantive, meaningful, and significant shift in U.S. drug policy in our lifetimes. It's both things can be true, that we want full descheduling, and yet rescheduling will also not only be historic, but also significantly impactful to so many of the businesses that are suffering right now under a ridiculous and dated federal regime around this plant, 280E and beyond. So I think rescheduling very much deserves celebration. And I think it also holds the unknown, which could be good and bad for the industry. And it will be good and bad for the industry. We will say that. But I am definitely choosing the tack that I think, in general, rescheduling cannabis from 1 to 3 will be a positive thing for the cannabis industry. It will take care of some of these primary and most pressing pain points. And I get that others want more or want to hold out for perfection, but we also know that perfection is the enemy of reality, or however that saying goes. And,
right.
And truth be told, we are seeing significant progress in this conversation around drug policy reform at state levels, but we're not seeing that progress at the federal level, and that's kind of the most important one. So let's celebrate this. Let's work toward it. Make sure that we are that we stand a chance and we have a seat at the table. I was talking with the National Cannabis Industry Association the other day just about everything they're working on, and they will be testifying at that meeting when it's time. And I'm glad that they will be there to have our backs, our best interest, and other stakeholders as well. We can no longer make this work. This is an untenable situation for the industry, and we need reform of some kind. Again, it's not perfect, but God, let's go. Let's work toward it, especially with some of the rhetoric we're hearing from some of the candidates.
Yeah, well said. I totally agree that phrase you mentioned, it's something like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Like where this is, it's not the end goal. It's not the end all be all where we're in the promised land now and never have to revisit this discussion. It is a crucial step along the way to getting there. And I've heard the same things, I'm sure you have, Ricardo, from people in the industry who would rather, they would rather not even see this happen. It seems like they just want to go for full decriminalization. And it's like, well, I mean, yeah, that'd be great. But, if we all had, candy and nuts and whatever, it'd be a great party. It's one of, whatever that phrase is too, where it's like, sure, things could be better, but let's not just put this completely off the table because it is a huge step forward. Another thing that you did bring up that I want to touch on are the witness list for that administrative hearing under the DEA for rescheduling. When I was looking at that list, one of the names that popped out at me was Smart Approaches to Marijuana. They're one of the groups that they send press releases into the GN newsroom inbox all the time. I read them. I struggle not to vomit as I'm reading them because they are filled with the same propaganda, it seems like, right out of last century's playbook. It seems like they're one of those groups that is kind of rehashing the Reefer Madness stuff. And so when I saw them on the list of witnesses for the DEA rescheduling hearing, my mind immediately went to, oh great, these are all anti-cannabis witnesses. The momentum is still on the pro-cannabis side, and they're going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting in this hearing to convince that judge that it shouldn't be rescheduled. But it sounds to me like you're saying there are maybe some pro-cannabis witnesses on this list as well. I guess what I'm just trying to say is that that's better than what I had thought based on just initially looking at that list. And so I just want to hear your perspective from that, looking at the witness list for this hearing. Do you feel pretty good in terms of how it's stacked up? How even would you say it is in terms of witnesses that are anti versus those on the pro-cannabis side?
Yeah, I have not seen the full list. I know that there's an MSO, an operator, and of course NCIA on the list, as I mentioned, representing the industry. I hope they create an equitable, kind of chamber of perspectives for that judge for this hearing. And at the same time, we are talking about the DEA, and the DEA is the cops, and the DEA do not want this. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it is skewed more toward anti-voices, but I'm also really putting some faith into this process. We are seeing sanity prevail in some of these conversations, in part because of the public health data is impossible to ignore. You mentioned that Project SAM and some of these other organizations that support cannabis prohibition, they are out there with the same playbook as they were a decade or two ago. And part of that is right, Don, but I would push back on the rest because, a lot of the narrative and the rhetoric that they were using 10, 15 years ago, they have been forced to change because the results of public health research at the state and federal level. The federal government produces the Monitoring the Future study every year. Massive public health study of our kids. What's happening with American kids, toddlers, babies, and the results from that year after year continue to be stupefying and so encouraging as it relates to the story around reprioritizing cannabis as a public health issue and not something that should be criminalized, because we are showing that whole claim of the prohibitionists of what about the children, it was rooted in fear-mongering nonsense. Because we are seeing those rates of consumption among youths in America, in legal and non-legal states, in medical and recreational states. Those rates are flat, if not going down, which is so dang encouraging. And I think that's a huge one, that we were able to shut up the prohibitionists on that one piece. And granted, now they're coming back with variations on a theme, right? Well, okay, what about these potent concentrates and what they're doing to the children? And it's like, yeah, truth be told, people who are not 21, people without that developed brain, should not be consuming cannabis of any kind,
right,
whether it's a concentrate or flower. So that just goes without saying. But at the same time, I love that we have forced them to change their rhetoric, all based on data and public health information. And we will continue forcing them to change their narrative until they don't have any narratives, or until we could at least meet into a more fact-based middle, where it's like, okay, not everybody should consume cannabis. Cannabis does have risks, and yet it's also a non-toxic plant that doesn't present a substantive risk to most consumers. When we can get there, great, but until then, we do have a long way to go, and hopefully we'll see all those perspectives represented in the hearings ahead of us.
I totally agree with you there. It has been satisfying to see those kinds of groups have to move the goalposts, because specifically the example you gave with the youth in America, they always did, do that what about the children, sort of the riskiness of them using it. And as you pointed out, that study which showed over the last 10 years that the use of it among those underage Americans has totally cratered. And so now seeing those groups like Project Sam and the others, the prohibitionist friendly groups, to see them now start talking about, well, let's look at the young adult use too, because that's really going up. But it's sort of like, well, yeah, but those are adults. They can, as I said last episode, I think they can use alcohol, they can gamble, they can rent cars, they can go serve the country. They're allowed to use cannabis as well. That shouldn't be sort of like a concern that's voiced. When you're an adult, you get to make your own decisions, and you're trusted with the responsibility of being that. And so it has been satisfying to see the changes here. Let me ask you, as the founder of Grasslands and as somebody who really thinks about the narrative of these things too, what's your opinion on the word marijuana? Because I've gone back and forth on the show with people about this. I've heard both sides of it, and I get it. I'm somebody that tries to use the word cannabis as much as I can, because I think that marijuana, just as an example, is loaded with the baggage of last century and all those negative connotations. And so I've done a lot to kind of just use cannabis as my word on the show, even titling the show that. But there are others who have kind of said to me, marijuana is what people, it's the term with which they're most familiar. It's the term that just moves the conversation forward. So I understand why some people still use it, but what's your opinion, Ricardo?
Yeah, I guess a cornerstone of marketing is that you have to meet the audience where they are. And a cornerstone of journalism is that you have to use the language that your audience is using, including some of the stakeholders you might be covering. And so I know that there is a theory out there that marijuana has racist origins, and I'm very open to seeing that evidence. I just have never had anybody share that with me.
Yeah.
Where is that? Of course, prohibition was rooted in racism, of course. Get that. But I think from the modern positioning perspective, we use them generally interchangeably. We lean on cannabis far more, simply because it's a more modern term. It's a more accurate term from a scientific, a biological perspective. And at the same time, we recognize that most state laws are written about marijuana. And most consumers are talking about marijuana, this older word that the industry doesn't like. And so we recognize that as we're referencing that, especially as we're talking to new adult use states like Ohio, or newer wannabe medical states like hopefully South Dakota here pretty soon, we will see that word being used in legal infrastructure and regulatory infrastructure. And so you have no choice but to at least acknowledge it that way. So we're open to both, but we very much lean on cannabis. It's just the better, more accurate word.
Sure. Gotcha. And I appreciate that. Let me ask you, if people are interested in getting, the services of Grasslands, if there is a company out there, if somebody is thinking of becoming an entrepreneur, starting their cannabis business, and they like what you're doing, like I do, where can people go to contact you and kind of explore, utilizing the services you guys offer?
Of course, yeah. A business really knows that it needs PR or marketing when it really needs that top of funnel awareness. So if you're looking at your sales funnel right now and you're like, okay, we're pretty good mid funnel, we just really need more ammunition at the top, that's a great opportunity to pull the trigger for PR. bring those new eyeballs in so they can become familiarized with your brand. It's all about awareness at the top, moving into consideration. So that's when you need us. You're launching a new store, releasing a new product, SKU, big partnership, going public, doing a big raise, whatever that might look like. And you can find more about Grasslands at mygrasslands.com.
There it is, listener, mygrasslands.com. And CEO and founder of Grasslands, Ricardo Baca, thank you so much for stopping by today and just sharing your perspective, talking a little about the coverage of the plant, this narrative that we're doing our best to try and, dismantle from last century, and just chipping away at this stigma that still exists around a plant that so many people can get a benefit from. And thanks for the work you're doing.
Straight up. Thanks for having me, Don.
And there you have it, listener. I'd like to thank one more time my guest, Ricardo Baca of Grasslands PR. They're doing such important work. I mean, again, you can understand if you listen to this show, their mission is exactly like mine right here. It's all about informing as well as entertaining, but really getting the messaging right as we are all looking to help cannabis sort of rebrand from last century's propaganda, which is critically important because, as I've said, it's important to distinguish. I understand people listening to this might think that I'm just pro-cannabis, and so I'm a cheerleader for it, and I'm always going to support that. But that's not the truth. The truth is, I understand it's not right for everybody. I know that it may not be your thing, and that's totally okay. I'm happy to, go outside and smoke a joint and then come inside and hang out with people, drinking a cocktail or not. Just having some water and a good conversation is fine by me. But it's incredibly important, I think, to try and undo the damage of the last nearly 100 years in this country and around the world that the war on drugs has caused, and the fear-mongering around the cannabis plant in terms of what it has baked into the public consciousness, no pun intended. But people are running around the world today who could maybe benefit from cannabis, who are too afraid to give it a shot or never will because of the, as Ricardo and I talked about, the brainwashing that took place over the last near century was so effective that they think this plant is just inherently evil and offers no medical benefits and risks addiction and brain melting and all the other stuff that was sort of pushed as part of that messaging. That is what we're trying to undo here. Because for those of us that have found it and found it to be beneficial, it's life-changing. I mean, if you've listened to me talk to people on this show, that is not an overstatement to say that it has changed for the positive many people's lives. Some benefits are small. I would even put as important as sleep is, sleep quality, getting 7-8 hours of good sleep at night, which was my big thing, is very different from recovering from a brain injury that restricted all of your senses, put you at odds with your wife and kids, and was really messing with your quality of life, which is the case for Daniel Carcillo, former NHL player who has been on this show. Corey Getz, the CBD surfer, had brain issues of his own, and his prognosis was not good, and he may very well not be alive today were it not for the healing power of CBD that he found. So these things are all real. Both sides of it are real, and I just simply think taking a more neutral view, allowing adults to make their own decisions about cannabis and whether it's right for them is important, rather than putting your thumb on the scale like the DEA has done and just tried to convince people from the outset that this plant is evil and offers no benefits. Now, on that note, there was some very discouraging news this week. Predictable, still very, very demoralizing. The DEA has pushed back, I should say, the judge in the potential rescheduling hearing that was called for by President Biden and the Health and Human Services Administration under him. The judge in that rescheduling case pushed back the legal process by at least 3 months. So now we've gone from, October of 23, which is when HHS really said this review should be kicked off. Now here we are in January of 25, and this process has been pushed back to at least April or May. And there are plenty in the space who say it may obviously go further than that if it ever gets picked up again. Because depending on when you're listening to this, a new president and administration is being inaugurated a few days from now, January 20th. And what happens after that regarding the process of rescheduling cannabis is anybody's guess. So it is discouraging. And I talked a little bit more in detail about this and gave some more context and perspective in this week's Weekly Chronic. I have linked that below. It's through Substack. It's free. It's a newsletter that I opened in October. I launched as sort of a companion piece to this podcast because there are news stories and things that happen throughout the week that I can't always get to on this hour-long show that I do on Fridays. So I wanted to start covering it in more depth. And so the Weekly Chronic is how I do that. But I offered a history and a bit of a timeline going back to 1937 when this prohibition really started. And so if you're interested in more information about these things, you can scroll down to the description notes, click on the Weekly Chronic, and subscribe. Those issues come out every Tuesday. Again, it's free, and you can get those in your email inbox. I usually schedule them to go out around 6 or 7 a.m. It's a 5 to a 10-minute read. And it's a different medium than listening to this podcast. You can read it over your morning coffee, maybe with a joint in hand. God, I missed that. Cannot wait to combine caffeine and cannabis again. But if you're somebody that likes to read in the morning and get your day started that way, the Weekly Chronic might be a nice newsletter to add to your kind of routine and your reading materials to get your day started. Just another way to kind of keep tabs on the news about cannabis and getting some more perspective on what changes. But that's something I wanted you to know, that our timeline has now been pushed back. And funny enough, at the same time as this rescheduling process gets pushed back, other sides of this industry are still moving forward. I mentioned the hemp product and the kind of tug of war that's happening not just in Illinois, but around the country. Last year, there was a representative in the U.S. House who floated a ban on hemp products countrywide. They've done it in California, or they're exploring that anyway. Other states have done the same thing. But on the other hand, there are states where cannabis is still not legal, and hemp products are the only options those people have. So this issue is in murky waters, just like a lot of this. But the farm bill that I mentioned earlier in 2018 effectively legalized hemp up to 0.3% THC. Those products are legal around the country right now. And unless something is banned, that's the case going forward. And because of that, and in sort of an acknowledgement of that, and maybe an opportunistic business grab here, something that I have foreshadowed on this show over the last couple of years has now come to pass. We've talked about how some states offer delivery services for cannabis and hemp products. I always thought that was going to end up being the purview of these gigantic companies like Uber Eats or DoorDash. And just last week, DoorDash announced that they will now deliver cannabis-infused gummies, drinks, and candy. Hemp, specifically, under that 0.3% THC threshold. There's an article that I've linked below. It's on Yahoo Finance. The story was originally published on Supermarket News. Hemp-derived products, like THC and CBD-infused gummies, drinks, and candy, now available for delivery on DoorDash, which they announced last Thursday. They're making products available in select markets where the sale of cannabis is legal. However, the San Francisco-based company stopped short of offering marijuana for delivery. So we're not talking about flower here. We're not talking about concentrates or vape carts. None of that smokable stuff just yet. But the hemp consumable products, gummies, candy, drinks, that is now, depending on where you are in the U.S., that could now be in your DoorDash app. These are available through DoorDash's fulfillment platform, DashMart, as well as retail operations like Total Wine and More, ABC Fine Wine and Spirits, and others. DoorDash created a new product page on the website, offering products like Cann, C-A-N-N, Blood Orange Cardamom, THC-infused social tonic, Giggly, G-I-G-L-I, Caramel Mocha Chocolates, damn, that sounds good, and Kava Joy Blueberry Muffin Delta-9 THC gummies. So I'm not affiliated with DoorDash here. This is not like a plug for them, but some people, have mobility issues. Maybe, and it's also freaking cold outside. So maybe this is something that appeals to you. I haven't tried it for myself yet. As I said, dry January, mercifully almost over. In February, I'm going to give this a shot. I'll let you know how it goes. I'd be shocked if Chicago is not one of the markets that they've offered this to. But on a separate note, if you haven't tried Cann, CANN, those were some of the first beverages I tried, some of the first cannabis beverages. They're fantastic. Not affiliated with them either. I just really enjoy their product. You know, if you've listened to the show at all, you know I'm big on the cannabis beverage space. I think it's absolutely about to explode. Not sure if I mentioned this on the show or not, but the Surgeon General just talked about potentially putting cancer warnings on alcohol labels like they do with cigarettes. Cannabis beverages are the great alternative to alcohol, especially as like a social tonic in a party setting. I think that hemp and cannabis beverages are absolutely about to go bonkers. And there are alcohol companies who are partnering with these cannabis companies to make some of these social tonics and drinks. Others see the writing on the wall too. So that's an article that I have also linked below that you can check out at your leisure. But on the heels of that, the announcement from DoorDash, a group who I mentioned in my conversation with Ricardo Baca, SAM, the Smart Approaches to Marijuana, the prohibitionist group who's very anti-legal cannabis and doing everything they can to kind of sway the public discussion back in that direction of last century. They put out a press release today, the 17th, headlined, DoorDash's drug delivery service, not plant, mind you, drug, skirts federal drug policies, risks public health and safety. They start this with the same old kind of rhetoric that Ricardo and I were talking about. Somebody think of the children is really the underlying message here. Parents whose children have been negatively impacted by today's commercially produced THC drugs are sounding the alarm after national online delivery service DoorDash announced it is now offering on-demand delivery of hemp-derived THC and CBD products, including gummies and beverages, substances known to be associated with mental and physical health consequences, especially for young people. DoorDash has launched its, quote, drugs on demand service, despite both houses of Congress having advanced proposals to close the Delta 8 loophole in 2024. Which is true. I did bring that up. And I'm not going to read any more of this because, honestly, these always depress me. And I'm not linking it below either. If you're interested in finding out more of these prohibitionist arguments that Sam makes, you can Google or put in your preferred search browser Smart Approaches to Marijuana, and you'll see what they put out. But I simply bring this up to you because last week DoorDash makes this announcement. This week, Sam, and I'm sure many other groups, are coming out with their pushback, their press releases that are spinning the same narratives of danger, 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 kids and drugs and drugs and kids. And we all need to, be fearful about this and yada, yada, yada. So when I talk about this lingering stigma, when I'm here on this show trying to offer information and perspective and keep it, as much as I am pro-cannabis, try and keep it as neutral as I can. When I say that there are parties on the other side invested heavily in keeping the status quo unchanged, in keeping the prohibition alive and well, SAM is a group that's right at the top of that list, and they're fighting hard to make sure that this rescheduling, to make sure that anything relating to hemp and cannabis does not change. So that is a part of why I'm here doing what I'm doing, trying to provide some reasonably unbiased information relating to the cannabis space. I just feel that is my duty, and trying to end this ridiculous stigma, it's an uphill battle, that's for sure. Anybody who knows anything about how information spreads, how salacious headlines are a lot more memorable than the dry facts and truth often are, anybody who knows anything about those things knows that this is an uphill battle. And we're trying to undo almost 100 years of this very successful fear-mongering done right by the U.S. government. That's what those of us in this space are kind of trying to do right now. And there are others like Sam who are just leaning into the other side, who are leaning into just banging the drum of, no, it's still unsafe, prohibit this, there are no benefits to it. It is a fight. It is a battle. Make no mistake about that. So another kind of rough news week in the cannabis space. Certainly not the way that any of us advocates would have wanted to start 2025 off. Definitely a bummer. Would love to light up right now and just kind of smoke my sorrows away. But again, dry January. Unforgiving. Really, really not thrilled with the decision I've made for myself. But I am thrilled to offer you another High Haiku themed on dry January to try and uplift us a little bit, to just give us a little bit of a happier note to end this episode on. So if you got something to light up, spark it. My man Reg Kiefer is going to take it away and read.
Cold nights pass sober, but February whispers. Cheers, the green returns. Wow. That right there was another High Haiku.
Thank you, Reg, and thank you, listener, for putting up with that and listening to this episode of the Cannabis Man podcast. I hope I provided some knowledge and information, and if I did, as I said, you can thank me by leaving a rating or a review. Even a comment or a text is lovely to let me know that I'm not just shouting into the void here. Let me know that you are hearing me and just confirm that you've listened to the Cannabis Man podcast. Really appreciate that. As I said, you can follow us on social media. Subscribe to the Weekly Chronic if you do want a little bit of a snapshot of news on Tuesday mornings in your email inbox. And if you like this content, if you want even more of this stuff, ad-free and uncensored, join the Patreon page. Scroll down, click the support the show link. It'll take you to Patreon. Become a subscriber there, and you will get these episodes starting next month, raw, uncensored. Sometimes I swear in these, and you'll hear me bleep them out. Not on the Patreon page. If you become a subscriber, if you become a patron, you will hear those swears, if that appeals to you. I also have started to cut down these conversations to meet a time limit on my hosting platform. These episodes will remain raw and uncensored, and the conversations totally uncut via Patreon. So if that sounds good to you, you can join at the Support the Show link below. In the meantime, as I always say, spend time with those you love. Ideally, share some cannabis with them, but if not, you'll never regret taking some extra time and spending it with those people you're close with, whoever those may be. Whomever makes you smile, makes you laugh, makes you glad to be alive. Give them a call, shoot them a text, and you and I will talk next week on the Cannabis Man podcast. Bye-bye. Cannabis Man is 100% originally crafted by myself, Don Kleppin. Original theme music written and composed by Yusu Kim, aka Good Son.